One stormy night in Chicago, and a wealthy man throws his pregnant wife out into the freezing cold because of a slanderous accusation from his mistress. 22-year-old Aria Bennett, pregnant and barefoot on the ice, penniless, collapses in the middle of a deserted street and nearly never gets up again. But that night, a black-armored SUV belonging to Chicago's most notorious mafia boss stops. And from there, everything changes forever. Don't go anywhere, mate. Hit like but. Comment with the city you're viewing so I know where in the world this story has touched you. The story begins now. The wind came in off Lake Michigan like something with teeth. It hit the north side of the Crow estate first, rattled the iron gates, stripped the last dead leaves from the oaks lining the driveway, then drove hard into the face of the woman standing barefoot on the frozen brick. Aria Bennett didn't flinch. Not because she was brave. She didn't flinch because she had nothing left. Her body had already gone past the point where cold registered as cold. It was just pressure now, just weight. She was 22 years old and 8 months pregnant, and she was standing outside in a February blizzard in a silk nightgown that cost more than most people's car payments. And the man she had married 18 months ago was watching her from behind the glass panel beside the front door. She could see his silhouette. She was certain of it. He wasn't moving. "Nathan!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She pressed her palm flat against the gate. The iron bit into her skin. "Nathan, please. It's freezing. Just let me—" The porch light went off. She stood there in the dark for a moment, breathing, watching the house settle back into itself like it had never known her at all. 3 years she'd walked those floors. She knew which staircase step creaked on the left side. She knew Nathan took his coffee with 2 sugars before noon and black after. She knew the way the master bedroom filled with gray morning light in winter, and how he'd looked at her once, just once, early in their marriage, like she was the only thing in the room. That man had not existed for a long time. Aria turned from the gate. Her feet hit the driveway, and the cold moved up through her soles like broken glass. She walked anyway. She didn't know where. The storm was a solid wall ahead of her, the streetlights swallowed by snow, the road gone somewhere under a foot of white. She walked because standing still wasn't an option anymore, and because the baby was moving, small rolling pressure, low in her belly, persistent and blind and alive. And that movement was the only thing keeping her legs working. She made it to the end of the long driveway before she started to shake. 2 hours earlier, the party had still been beautiful. Nathan Crow threw quarterly dinners the way other men built monuments, with the specific intention of being remembered. The house had been full of the kind of people who wore watches worth more than small houses and laughed at things that weren't funny. Crystal glasses, caterers in white jackets, a string quartet in the East Parlor playing something classical and forgettable. Aria had dressed carefully. She always dressed carefully for these things, aware that she was younger than most of the wives, that she came from a different kind of money. Old trust money, family money, the kind that was quiet and documented and hers, not performed. She wore deep burgundy. She kept her hair up. She smiled at the right moments. She had almost made it through the entire evening. It was Nathan's business partner, Douglas Fenn, who broke it open. He'd had too much scotch and he thought he was being charming when he leaned across the dinner table and said to Nathan, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Heard your wife's been spending time out in Evanston with that architect fellow, Holden, or whatever his name is. Saw them myself, couple weeks back. They looked comfortable." The table went quiet. Aria set down her fork. "That's not what that was." "I'm not saying anything," Douglas said, still smiling, like it was a joke. "Just making conversation." Nathan said nothing. He was cutting his steak. He kept cutting it, very precisely, for a long moment. Then he looked up at Aria. She had seen that look before. It wasn't anger. Anger she could have worked with. This was something colder, something already decided. "Nathan," she kept her voice even, "I ran into James Holden at the zoning board meeting for the foundation. You know that. I told you about it. It was 10 minutes in a parking lot." "You told me you were at the foundation offices," Nathan said. "I was. And then the zoning board was next door and James was—" "You told me," Nathan said again, very quietly, "that you were at the foundation offices." She understood then that it didn't matter. Whatever she said, whatever truth she laid out, it wouldn't fit the shape of the story he'd already built in his head. Maybe he'd been building it for a while. Maybe Douglas Fenn hadn't been making conversation at all. Nathan pushed back from the table. He addressed the room, not her. I apologize for this disruption. My wife and I need a moment. But the moment happened in front of all of them. In the foyer, voices low but posture rigid, and the caterers moving very carefully around the edges of the room, eyes forward, hearing everything. I want you out of this house tonight. Nathan, I'm 8 months pregnant. I'm aware of that. She stared at him. You can't be serious. My lawyer will contact you. Don't take anything that isn't yours. Everything here is... She stopped, breathed. Nathan, listen to me. I didn't do anything. You know me. You've known me for 3 years. I need you to hear what I'm telling you. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you've already solved. I've heard enough. She didn't have her shoes. She'd slipped them off under the dinner table the way she always did, a habit she'd had since childhood. And by the time she understood what was happening, really understood, in her body, Nathan had already opened the front door and the security code on the gate had already been changed, because when she got to the end of the driveway and pressed her thumb to the keypad, nothing happened. Nothing happened. The road beyond the estate was called Miller Creek Road, and it wound for 2 miles through dark trees before it hit anything resembling civilization. Arya knew this. She had driven it 1,000 times. She had never walked it. She walked it now. Her feet had stopped hurting somewhere in the first quarter mile, which she understood, distantly, was not a good sign. The snow was coming sideways. She couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. She kept one hand on her stomach and one arm crossed over her chest, and she moved forward because forward was the only direction she had. She thought about her phone. She'd left it on the nightstand upstairs. She thought about the neighbors, but the Crow estate was set back from other properties by design, isolation by money, and the nearest house was a half-mile off the main road. She thought about her mother, who had died 4 years ago, and her father, who had died when she was 9, and the family trust that her grandmother had established before any of them were born, the one her mother had always told her would be hers at 25. 3 more years. That money was 3 more years away, and Nathan knew the timeline exactly, and she had never once, not once, thought to wonder why that number seemed to matter so much to him. She was thinking about it now. The cold moved into her chest like a hand closing around her lungs. Her breathing went ragged. Her knees hit something, the guardrail at the road's edge, low and rusted, and she grabbed it and didn't let go for a long time, just stood there, bent forward, breathing into the wind, her body running the numbers without her permission. She couldn't make it 2 miles. She knew that now. Her body knew it. The baby moved again. Harder this time, insistent. I know, she thought, or maybe said out loud. I know. I'm trying. She straightened up. She took 3 more steps, then 4. Then her legs went out from under her, and the snow came up to meet her, and it was softer than she expected, softer and quieter. And the wind dropped away, and the cold stopped being cold and started being something almost like warmth, which she also understood was not a good sign, but understanding and caring were 2 different things, and right now she could only manage one of them. She closed her eyes. The convoy moved through the storm in tight formation, 3 vehicles, black, no plates visible through the snow, running Miller Creek Road because the highway had been closed for an hour and the route manager had rerouted them without thinking about what kind of road this was at 2 a.m. in February. Marco Russo rode in the second vehicle. He always rode second. Front was for scouts, back was for support, and second was where you needed to be if something went wrong in either direction. He'd learned that from a man who was dead now, killed for a different kind of mistake, and Marco had spent the decade since making sure he didn't make mistakes. He was 34 years old, and he had been working for Luca Moretti for 9 of those years, and he was not, by any standard anyone would use publicly, a good man. He knew what the organization did. He knew where the money came from. He'd done things he didn't catalog, because cataloging them didn't change them, and it didn't help him sleep either way. But he looked out the window. That was the thing about Marco. He always looked out the window. He saw the shape in the snow because the headlights caught the dark of her hair against the white. Just a flash, wrong color, wrong texture, something that didn't belong. And he said stop before he'd finished processing what he was seeing. What? The driver, a man named Teo, eased off the gas. "Stop the car." Stop the car." Teo stopped. Marco was out before the vehicle fully settled, moving around the front of the SUV into the headlight wash, and then he was crouching beside her. Young, very pregnant, lips going blue at the edges. And his hand was at her throat before he thought about it, feeling for a pulse, finding one, weak and uneven. "I need the trauma kit," he called back over his shoulder. "And someone wake the doc." "The doc is in vehicle 3, Teo said, coming up behind him. "Then wake him up." He didn't move her yet. "You didn't move them until you knew what you were moving." He pulled off his coat, $2,000 coat, Luca's Christmas gift. He thought about this briefly and then set it aside, and laid it over her and watched her chest move with one breath, then another, then a third. A door opened at the back of the convoy, and he could hear arguing. The doctor, an old man named Fiore, who was technically Luca's personal physician, but functioned as emergency trauma support when the organization needed it, which was not infrequently. And then boots in the snow, and Fiore was kneeling on the other side of her, already pulling gloves on. "How long?" Fiore said. "I don't know. Temperature's been below 12 for 3 hours. If she was out here..." Fiore pressed 2 fingers below her jaw, pulled back one eyelid. "She's alive. Barely. We need to move." "She's pregnant," Marco said. Fiore looked at him. "Yes, I can see that. We need to move now." Marco slid his arms under her. Lighter than she should have been, this far along, and that told him something too, and stood. She made a sound. Not a word. Just sound. He moved toward the second vehicle, and Teo opened the rear door, and Marco got in with her, arranged her across the back seat, and kept his hand flat against her arm because it was something to do, and because she was still making that small sound, and he had no idea what it meant, but he preferred it to silence. "Tell the manor," he said to Teo. "Medical wing. Now." Teo was already on the radio. Marco looked down at the woman in his back seat. Her face had started to regain some color from the vehicle's heat. Her hands, both hands, he noticed, were pressed flat over her stomach, even unconscious, protecting the thing she was carrying. Pure reflex, pure instinct. He looked away. He looked out the window at the storm. The medical wing of Moretti Manor occupied the entire east corridor of the 3rd floor, and Luca Moretti had authorized its construction 11 years ago not out of generosity, but out of pragmatism. Organizations like his generated injuries. Injuries generated questions. Questions generated exposure. It was cheaper and cleaner to handle things internally. Luca was not a sentimental man. He had not become what he was by being sentimental. He was 51 years old, and he stood 6 feet, and he kept his gray close-cropped because vanity was a liability. He had been awake when the call came in from Marco, sitting in his study with a glass of water and a set of financial reports he needed to sign off on before morning, and he had heard Marco out in full before he spoke. "She's alive?" "Yes. Fiore's with her." "What do you know about her?" "Nothing yet. No identification on her. She was on Miller Creek Road in a nightgown." Luca was quiet for a moment. Miller Creek Road ran past exactly 2 properties of consequence, a shuttered industrial park and the Crow Estate. He knew the Crow Estate. He knew the name on it. He knew the general shape of the man's business operations, the way you knew the operations of anyone who moved money in his city, even money that had nothing to do with him. "Crow's wife," he said. It wasn't a question. "Could be," Marco said. "Make sure Fiore has what he needs. Already done. Keep her in the East Wing." He paused. "No one discusses this outside the house." He put down the phone and returned to his financial reports and sat for a moment without reading them. Outside his window, the storm was breaking itself against the glass. And down in the city, the lights were going on and off in patterns that meant nothing. And somewhere in the east corridor of his own house, a young woman who had been thrown out into a blizzard 8 months pregnant was either going to survive the night or she wasn't. He picked up his pen. He told himself it was not his problem. He told himself it cleanly and clearly, the way he said everything to himself, without decoration, without ambiguity. He put the pen down again. He was still sitting there when Marco knocked on the study door 40 minutes later. Fiore says she's stable, Marco said. Baby's okay. Core temp's coming up. Luca nodded. She's going to have questions when she wakes up, Marco said. She will. What do you want me to tell her? Luca looked at his financial reports, at the numbers that had run his life for 3 decades, at the weight of the city he carried in this chair, in this room, night after night. Tell her she's safe, he said. Tell her that first. The rest can wait until morning. Marco nodded and started to go. Marco. He stopped. You did right, Luca said. Stopping. Marco didn't answer. He left. Luca turned back to his window. The storm was still going. The city was still lit. And somewhere not far from here, a man named Nathan Crow was sleeping in his warm house, confident in the decisions he'd made tonight. Luca thought about that. He thought about it for a long time. Arya opened her eyes at 4:15 in the morning and did not know where she was. The ceiling was high and painted cream, and there was a medical monitoring unit beside her bed that was not a hospital unit. Too quiet, too private, no institutional smell. And she was warm, genuinely warm, for the first time in what felt like forever. She lay still and took inventory of herself. Hands, feet. She could feel her feet. Good. She was connected to an IV line. Her nightgown had been replaced with something soft and clean. She put both hands on her stomach. The baby moved. A slow, deliberate roll, the kind that felt almost like reassurance. Arya closed her eyes. She breathed. Then she opened them and looked at the man sitting in the chair against the wall. He was 30-something, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been broken at least once and had healed into something harder than it started. He wasn't asleep. He was watching her with the stillness of someone who had spent a lot of time watching things. You're awake, he said. Where am I? Somewhere safe. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice even and direct. My name's Marco. You were on Miller Creek Road. You'd been outside long enough that it was becoming a problem. We brought you here. We. My convoy. I work for the household. She parsed that. Whose household? He looked at her for a moment. That's a conversation for when you're feeling more steady. I'm steady now. He almost smiled at that. Didn't quite. The doctor says you're both okay. You and the baby. You need to stay warm, stay still, stay hydrated. You lost about 2 hours of body temperature you can't afford to lose again. He said it without softness, just information, delivered straight. 2 hours, she said. Give or take. She thought about what had happened in those 2 hours before she'd lost consciousness. About Nathan's face in the foyer. About the keypad at the gate and the porch light going off. About the shape of what she'd been too naive or too hopeful or too in love to see until tonight. The baby moved again. Okay, Arya said quietly, more to herself than to him. Marco watched her. You want to tell me what happened out there? She looked at the ceiling. Not particularly. That's fine. But I need to know something. She turned her head toward him. The man who lives here. Who is he? Marco held her gaze. He didn't hesitate, which she respected. His name is Luca Moretti. She knew that name. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. It lived in a specific register. The kind of name people said quietly in certain rooms. The kind of name attached to certain news stories that always seemed to resolve without resolution. The kind of name that made lawyers and politicians choose their words very carefully. Arya looked at the monitoring unit beside her, at the IV line in her arm, at the clean room and the careful silence, and the man sitting watch in the chair. She thought about Nathan Crow, who had locked the gates behind her. She thought about what it meant that she had ended up here, of all places, in this house, under this roof. And somewhere beneath the fear and the cold still working its way out of her bones, something quiet and dangerous was beginning to sharpen. A question she hadn't let herself ask before tonight, about the family trust and the timeline and the look on Nathan's face in that foyer. Not anger, something colder, something that had been planned. Get some sleep, Marco said. I don't think I can. Try anyway. She turned back to the ceiling. The storm was still audible somewhere beyond the walls. Muffled now, distant but present. Still going. She had no phone, no money, no shoes, no documentation of anything. But she was alive, and the baby was alive. And something her mother had told her once, years ago, when Arya had been too young to understand what she meant, was working its way to the surface now. The trust is yours, her mother had said. Whatever happens. It's yours, and it's documented. And no one can take what's documented. Arya closed her eyes. She thought, what if someone's been trying? She thought, what if Nathan's been trying for longer than tonight? And she thought, what if the man sleeping somewhere in this house isn't the danger I should be afraid of? Outside, the storm kept going. Inside, Marco Russo sat in his chair and watched the door, the way he always watched things. Steady, patient, already thinking 3 steps ahead of the problem. Neither of them slept, and in his study, 1 floor up, Luca Moretti sat with his untouched financial reports and his glass of water, and the particular silence of a man who has just made a decision he hasn't yet admitted to himself. And his phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number, 4 words that made something cold move through his chest. He read the message. He read it again. He set the phone face down on the desk. She was never supposed to survive. The text sat on Luca's desk like a splinter under the skin. She was never supposed to survive. He didn't pick the phone back up. He sat with his hands flat on the desk surface and his breathing steady and deliberate, the way he'd trained himself to breathe when something surprised him, which was rare enough that the discipline almost never got tested anymore. He was 51 years old and very few things surprised him. This surprised him, not the content. He'd understood the content immediately, the way you understand a language you grew up in. Someone had wanted the girl dead. Someone had known she'd be on that road. Someone had sent this message to tell him what exactly? That he'd interfered? That he'd made an enemy? That he should have kept driving? What surprised him was the number. Unknown, yes. Untraceable, probably. But the syntax was clean and the timing was precise, sent within minutes of Arya's arrival at the manor, which meant someone in his convoy, or someone watching his convoy, or someone who had access to information that should not have been accessible. He picked the phone up. He called Marco. Marco answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. The convoy route tonight, Luca said. Who authorized the Miller Creek reroute? A pause. Short. Teo said it came through dispatch. Highway closure. Get me the dispatch record, and I want to know who else knew our movement tonight. Another pause. Longer. You think the girl wasn't an accident? I think accidents don't send text messages. He read it to Marco. Verbatim. No editorializing. The silence on the other end had a specific texture. Marco processing, Marco filing, Marco already 3 moves into the problem. I'll have the dispatch record by 6. You want security on her room? I want it quiet. 1 man. Someone you trust completely. That's a short list. I know. Use it anyway. He hung up. He looked at the financial reports. He didn't read them. Us. By 6 in the morning, the storm had broken and left the city scraped clean and white and brutal under a pale sky. And Arya was sitting up in the medical bed eating toast that someone had brought without her asking, which meant she was being watched more carefully than she'd been told. She ate the toast. She was hungry enough that pride wasn't a factor. Dr. Fiore came in at 6:30. A small, precise man in his 70s, with the kind of hands that had clearly been trained for something delicate and had never quite lost the posture of it. He checked her vitals without much conversation, pressed 2 fingers against the side of her stomach with professional efficiency, asked her to breathe in and out, watched the monitoring readout, and then sat down in the chair Marco had occupied through the night. The baby is in good position, he said. Heart rate is normal. Your core temperature is restored. You'll feel the fatigue for several days. Your body burned significant resources last night. You need to eat, rest, and avoid stress. Arya looked at him. Is that a joke? It's a medical directive. What you do with it is your business. He folded his hands in his lap. You're approximately 34 weeks. The baby could deliver early without serious consequence, but we would prefer she doesn't. So, eat, rest, do not agitate yourself unnecessarily. She, Arya said. Fiore paused. nodded once. Slip of the tongue. I apologize. She didn't think it was a slip. He'd seen the monitoring data. She filed it away. A daughter, and felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy, but lived in the narrow corridor between them. I need a phone, she said. I'll pass that along. I need it today. I'll pass that along today. He stood, straightened his jacket. Someone will come to speak with you this morning. I'd suggest eating more before then. He left. Arya ate more. She ate everything on the tray, mechanically, efficiently, because Fiore was right and she knew her body and her body needed fuel. She thought while she ate. She cataloged what she knew and what she suspected and where the gaps were, and the gaps were very large and shaped like Nathan Crow's face. The family trust, established by her grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, in 1987. Managed by a law firm in the Loop, Harwick and Associates, 3 partners, old money discretion. Arya had received detailed accounting every year on her birthday. The trust was valued at last report at approximately $430 million. It transferred to her full control at age 25, per the terms of the original document, with no provision for spousal access. No provision for spousal access. She told Nathan this. She told him before they married, clearly, in the presence of her own attorney. He'd been gracious about it. He'd said it didn't matter. She had believed him. She looked at the window. Snow on the sill, pale morning light. Nathan's business operations, from what she'd observed across 18 months of marriage, were profitable but leveraged, aggressively, sometimes uncomfortably so. He borrowed against future returns. He moved money in complicated patterns that he'd explained to her once in terms she'd mostly followed, and then never raised again, because he'd made it clear that his finances were his domain and hers were hers, and that arrangement had seemed reasonable at the time. She thought about what reasonable had cost her. She thought about what it would cost her daughter. So, Marco came back at 8. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and had made peace with that fact a long time ago. He brought coffee, 2 cups, which told her something about his assumptions, and sat in the chair and set 1 cup on the bedside table and drank from the other without ceremony. She took the coffee. It was good coffee. Real coffee. Not the institutional sludge she'd expected. The man who owns this house, she said, Luca Moretti. He wants to talk to me. He will. This afternoon. Why not now? Because he's dealing with something. Marco's voice was flat. Not defensive, just accurate. Something that involves me. He looked at her over his coffee cup. What makes you say that? Because you're here instead of sleeping, and you look like sleeping is something you needed about 3 hours ago. He almost did the not quite smile again. Sharp, he said. It didn't sound like a compliment or an insult, just an observation, like noting the weather. I want to know what's happening, Arya said. I understand I'm in a position where I don't have a lot of leverage. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'm also not going to sit in this room and eat toast and wait for people to decide what I need to know. Marco looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee. What do you know about your husband's finances? The directness caught her slightly off guard. She adjusted. Enough to know they're complicated. Why? Because my employer has reason to believe last night wasn't an impulsive decision on your husband's part. He said it clean, no decoration. We think there's planning behind it. We're trying to understand the shape of it. Arya was quiet for a moment. The trust, she said. What trust? My family trust. $430 million. Comes to me at 25. She watched his face. Nathan knew the terms before we married. He agreed to them. Marco's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it. A calibration, a small internal update. He picked up his coffee again. How far out are you from 25? 3 years. He nodded slowly. He was connecting the same things she'd been connecting. If I died, Arya said carefully, testing the shape of the words, or if my credibility was destroyed, if I was declared unfit or complicit in something, what happens to the trust? I don't know trust law, Marco said. Nathan does. He has lawyers who do. She looked at the window again. Last night wasn't about the affair accusation. That was the reason. It wasn't the cause. No, Marco said. We don't think it was. Then what do you think? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, we think someone was supposed to find you this morning. Not us. The room went very still. What does that mean? It means the reroute that brought our convoy down Miller Creek Road last night was not a standard dispatch decision. He said it precisely, watching her face. Someone redirected us. We don't know yet if they wanted us to find you, or if someone else was supposed to find that road first and our presence was an unexpected variable. Arya set down her coffee cup. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. He tried to kill me, she said. We don't know that yet. I do. Her voice was quiet and final. I know Nathan Crow. I know how he thinks. He doesn't leave variables. He doesn't leave loose ends. She pressed both hands flat on the blanket over her stomach. I was supposed to be a loose end that resolved itself. Marco said nothing. His silence confirmed it without confirming it. I need that phone, Arya said. Now, not this afternoon. Now. She called her attorney first, a woman named Sandra Chu, who had represented her family's interests for 11 years, and who picked up on the third ring despite the hour with the focused alertness of someone who'd been expecting difficult news. Arya, where are you? Safe. I can't say more than that right now. She was aware of Marco in the doorway, not listening, she thought, or not obviously listening, but present. I need you to look at the trust documents today. I need to know what happens if I'm declared legally incompetent, or if I'm found to have committed a crime. Any crime. A pause. Why? Because I think Nathan has been looking at the same question. Sandra's breathing changed. Arya heard it. I'll pull the documents this morning. Arya, are you and the baby? We're fine. We're both fine. She closed her eyes briefly. I need you to also look at any documentation of the marriage that touched on the trust terms, any modifications he may have tried to introduce, anything I signed in the last 18 months that I should look at again. That's a significant review. I know. Start today. Arya. Sandra's voice was careful now, measured. If Nathan is making a legal move against the trust, we have defenses. But I need you somewhere I can reach you. I need you to be visible. Disappearing is going to... I'm not disappearing. I'm recovering. She opened her eyes. I'll be in touch. Every day. I promise. She hung up. She looked at Marco. He was examining the door frame with great apparent interest. You heard that, she said. Some of it. Does your employer know about the trust? He knew your name. Miller Creek Road runs past the Crow estate. He made a reasonable inference. But not the amount. Marco looked at her directly. No, not the amount. She thought about Luca Moretti, about what a man like that did with information like that, about whether she was trading one danger for another, and whether the math on that trade made any sense at all. She thought about the alternative, which was Nathan, and the road, and the cold. 430 million, she said. Now he knows. Marco nodded once. She couldn't read his face. Good, she said. I want him to know exactly what Nathan is after, because whatever he decides to do with that information, it can't be worse than what Nathan's already decided. Luca Moretti came to her room at 2 in the afternoon. He was taller than she'd expected. Not the height. She'd expected tall. The stillness. He moved with the specific economy of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was unnecessary information, and he stopped inside the doorway and looked at her for a moment before he came further in, like he was checking something. She looked back. She didn't look away. He sat in the chair that had apparently become the chair, and he did not bring coffee or food or any props for the conversation. He just sat. How are you feeling? He said. Not a question exactly, more like an acknowledgement that the question existed. Better than last night. Good. He paused. Marco told me about the trust. I told him to. I know. I want to be clear about something. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, the same posture Marco used, and she wondered if that was something they'd developed together, or if it was just what certain kinds of men looked like when they were being direct. I don't have any interest in your inheritance. I'm telling you that now because you're going to think it eventually, and I'd rather deal with it now than have it be a current running underneath everything else. She studied him. You're telling me not to worry about your motives. I'm telling you my motive. You can verify it or not as you see fit. What is your motive? He was quiet for a moment. Someone sent me a text message last night. 4 words. I'm going to tell you what it said because you have the right to know. He said the words exactly. She was never supposed to survive. The room was very quiet. Someone in your organization, Arya said, or someone watching it. We don't know yet. But whoever it was, they wanted you to know I was still alive. Or they wanted me to know that letting me find you was a mistake they intended to correct. She thought about that, about the 2 interpretations and what each one meant and which one was more dangerous, and whether it even mattered because she was here either way, in this house, with this man, and Nathan Crow was somewhere across the city sleeping or not sleeping, knowing or not knowing that she was still breathing. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because if someone comes for you here, I want you to understand why, and I want you to be prepared, not surprised. Surprised people make bad decisions. He said it without drama, like it was operational information. And because your husband has moved into a space that intersects with my city, that's not something I ignore. He's a real estate developer. He's a man who's borrowed significant sums from people who are not banks, and who has apparently decided that his pregnant wife's death is a more efficient solution than restructuring his debt. Luca said it flat and unadorned. That makes him my problem, separately from what he did to you. Arya looked at him, really looked at him. Not at the reputation, not at the name, but at the face, which was tired in the way that long-term wait made people tired, and which was watching her with the careful attention of someone who was used to reading rooms and was finding this one harder than usual. You want something from me, she said. I want information about his finances, his partners, the shape of what he's built, and where it connects to the people he borrowed from. He held her gaze. You were inside that marriage for 18 months. You know things you don't know you know yet. And in exchange, you're already here. You're already safe. I'm not dangling that as a negotiation. He sat back slightly. In exchange, I find out what happened last night, and I make sure it doesn't happen again. To you or the baby. Arya thought about Sandra Chu and the trust documents, and the 3 years she had left until 25, and what Nathan apparently intended to do with those 3 years. She thought about the text message. 4 words. The specific cruelty of reducing a person to that. She looked at Luca Moretti, a man who ran things she didn't want to name out loud, a man who had, for reasons that were apparently complicated and not entirely altruistic, kept her alive. I'll tell you what I know, she said, but I want something else besides protection. He waited. I want resources to investigate the trust tampering myself. My lawyer is already on it, but I need more. I need access to documentation, financial records, whatever your people can find. She said it steadily. Nathan forged something. I don't know what yet, but I know how he thinks, and he would have built a foundation before he moved. I want to find it. Luca studied her. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but the edge of something that might have been respect. That can be arranged. Then we have an arrangement. He nodded once. He stood to go. Moretti. He stopped. The text message, she said. The person who sent it. Do you think they're inside your house? He looked at her. I think it's possible. Then we're both in danger. Yes, he said. We are. He left. Arya sat with that for a long time. The specific weight of we in a sentence like that, coming from a man like that, in a house she didn't know, carrying a daughter she hadn't named yet. She pressed her hands flat on her stomach. The baby moved, slow and deliberate, present. I know, Arya thought. I know. We're going to have to be very careful. Marco found the dispatch record at 4 in the afternoon, and what it showed him made him sit down in the corridor outside the server room and stay there for 3 minutes without moving. The reroute to Miller Creek Road had been authorized at 11:47 the previous night. It had come through their internal dispatch system using a verified operator code. The code belonged to a man named Dario Sette. Dario Sette had worked for Luca Moretti for 6 years. He was 31 years old. He handled route management and convoy logistics for every movement the organization made in the northern quarter of the city. He was also, Marco knew, had known for 2 years, had never had reason to think mattered, the nephew by marriage of Douglas Fenn. Douglas Fenn, who had spoken at Nathan Crow's dinner table last night. Douglas Fenn, who had started the conversation that had ended with Aria Bennett on a frozen road. Marco sat in the corridor and thought about the specific shape of what he was looking at. The inside man, the dinner party, the reroute, the text message, and understood that whatever this was, it had been planned well before last night. Last night was not an improvisation. Last night was a scheduled event that had simply... Marco didn't move for 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he was looking at his watch when he sat down, and he was looking at it when he stood back up. And the number between those 2 moments was the amount of time it took him to understand the full weight of what he was holding. Not the logistics of it. The logistics were already clear. The weight of it, the specific human cost of 6 years of proximity, of trust extended and accepted and quietly, carefully weaponized, that took 4 minutes to settle into something he could carry without dropping. Dario Sette. He said the name quietly in the empty corridor, the way you test a word that's changed meaning on you. Then he put his phone in his pocket, stood up, and went to find Luca. He found him in the east parlor, standing at the window with his back to the room, which was the posture Luca used when he was already 3 steps into a problem and didn't want company until he'd finished the 4th. Marco had learned to read that posture the way sailors read weather. He came in and closed the door and didn't say anything, and Luca turned around and looked at him and read the answer in his face before Marco opened his mouth. "Tell me," Luca said. Marco told him. Dario Sette, the operator code, the timestamp, Douglas Fenn. He laid it out in sequence, no commentary, just the facts in the order they happened, because that was how Luca needed information. Clean, chronological, without the narrator's fingerprints on it. Luca listened without interrupting. When Marco finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Where's Dario now?" Luca said. "Dispatch office. Day shift." "Is he aware we pulled the records?" "Not unless someone told him." Luca nodded slowly. His face was doing the thing it did when the anger was present, but completely interior. No surface tells, no jaw tension, nothing visible. Just a quality of absolute stillness that was somehow worse than visible anger. Marco had seen it maybe a dozen times in 9 years. It never got easier to be in the room with. "I want him in the lower office in 20 minutes, Luca said. "Don't tell him why. Don't give him any indication. If he runs, we'll know more than we know now. And if he doesn't, then we'll know something different." He looked at Marco steadily. "You brought him in 6 years ago." "I did." "That's not an accusation." "I know." Marco held his gaze. "It still sits on me." Luca said nothing to that, which was the only honest response. He moved toward the door. "Luca." Marco said it quietly. "There's one more thing. The connection to Fenn. Fenn is Crow's partner, but Fenn also has exposure on the Lakeshore Development Project. The one with the zoning irregularities. The one your attorneys flagged 8 months ago." Luca stopped. "That project ran through 2 of our shell intermediaries," Marco said. "Clean on paper, but if Fenn is working with Crow, and Crow is coming after the girl's trust, and someone is inside our dispatch..." He paused. "This might not just be about the money she's carrying." The silence stretched. "They might be building something against us," Marco said. "Using the girl as the opening move." Luca turned that over. "Get Dario." Dario Sette walked into the lower office looking mildly confused and not particularly afraid, which told Marco one of 2 things. Either he was innocent and the code had been used without his knowledge, or he was good enough at this that he'd prepared for the possibility of being called in. He was 29 feet into the room before he registered Luca standing against the far wall, and then his stride changed. Not much, a half beat of hesitation, the body betraying what the face was working to hold. And he recovered it fast, but not fast enough. Marco saw it. Luca saw it. Dario knew they saw it. "Sit down, Dario," Luca said. Dario sat. He was 31 years old, and he had one of those faces that looked younger than it was. Open, slightly soft, the kind of face that made people extend benefit of the doubt, because it seemed like it hadn't learned deception yet. Marco had once thought that face was just his face. "There was a reroute last night," Luca said. "Miller Creek Road. It came through dispatch at 11:47. Your operator code was used." Dario's expression arranged itself into puzzlement. It was very good puzzlement. I wasn't on shift last night. I was off at 9. I know when you were off shift." "Then someone must have—" "Stop," Luca said. Not loud. The word just arrived with a weight that occupied the room and pushed everything else to the edges. Dario stopped. Luca looked at him for a long moment. The silence did more work than any question could have. Dario's hands were on the table. Marco watched them. The left one was still. The right one moved slightly. A barely perceptible curl of the fingers, the hand wanting to make a fist and being told not to by the part of the brain still performing composure. "Douglas Fenn," Luca said. And that was when Dario's face broke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a collapse. It was just a small, specific failure of the muscles around his eyes. A tightening, and then a release, and then the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. Except the putting down is not relief. It's the beginning of consequence. "I need you to understand something," Dario said. His voice had changed. The confusion was gone. What replaced it wasn't defiance. It was something more exhausted than that. "They had my sister." The room stayed quiet. "Elena. She's been in a residential program in Evanston for 8 months. Addiction. It costs $4,200 a month, and I've been covering it because she doesn't have anyone else." He looked at the table. "Fenn found out about it. I don't know how. 4 months ago he came to me with a very simple arrangement. He said he'd cover Elena's program for the next 2 years. He said all he needed was access to the routing system when he asked for it. And last night he asked for it," Marco said. "Last night was the first time. I swear to you, 4 months of nothing, and then last night he texted me a specific reroute and said it was time." Dario looked up at Luca. "I didn't know there was a woman on that road. I didn't know what it was for. I thought it was about moving something. Product, money. I don't know. I didn't ask because I knew not to ask." "You rerouted a Moretti convoy," Luca said, "for a man you knew was connected to my enemies without asking what it was for." Dario held his gaze. "Yes." "Because of your sister." "Yes." The room was very quiet. Marco looked at Luca. Luca's face had returned to the stillness, but it was a different quality of stillness now. Not the cold anger of before, but something more complicated. A man doing math that had human variables in it. "Where is Fenn now?" Luca said. "I don't know. He contacts me. I don't contact him." "Does he know the reroute didn't work? That the woman survived?" Dario hesitated. "I don't know what he knows." "Did you send a text message last night, 4 words, to this number?" Luca held up his phone. Dario stared at it. "No, that's not... No, I don't have that number." Marco believed him. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad. They put Dario in a room on the 2nd floor. Not a cell, not bound, just a room with a locked door and a guard outside who had instructions not to speak to him. Marco checked on him once, an hour later, and found him sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands between his knees, staring at the floor with the specific vacancy of a man rehearsing his own destruction and finding it as bad as he'd imagined. Marco didn't say anything. He pulled the door closed. He went upstairs to check on Arya, because that was apparently his function now. The person who went between the rooms and carried information and checked on the woman who was sleeping in the medical wing with a daughter she hadn't named yet and a $430 million target on her back. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting up in bed with a legal pad that someone had brought her, covered in handwriting, columns, dates, names, amounts, working. She looked up when he came in. "Dario Setti," she said. He stopped. "How do you know that name?" "I don't." I know Douglas Fenn. She turned the legal pad so he could see it. Fenn has been Nathan's business partner for 6 years, but before that, he worked for a development company called Mercer Capital. I found that in the records Nathan kept in his home office. I used to file documents for him when his assistant was out. I never thought about it. She tapped the pad. Mercer Capital folded in 2019 under fraud allegations. The case was dropped. I always wondered why Nathan had those records. Now I think Fenn brought them as, I don't know, insurance, history, proof that he knew how to make problems go away. Marco sat down. Dario Set is Fenn's wife's nephew. Arya absorbed this. He's inside your organization. Was, she repeated. She looked at the pad. Nathan didn't do this alone. He's smart, but he's transactional. He thinks in deals. Someone else designed the shape of this. She looked up. Fenn designed it. Nathan funded it or supplied the motive, but Fenn built it. Why do you say that? Because Nathan would have just cut my brake lines, she said flatly. Fenn would think about what happens after, about exposure, about timing, about how to make a woman dying in a snowstorm look like misfortune instead of murder. She set down the pen. This has Fenn's architecture. Nathan just opened the door. Marco looked at the legal pad, at the columns of dates and amounts and the connections she'd drawn between them with a precision that made him recalibrate, again, what he was dealing with. There's something else, he said. The reroute. Dario says Fenn contacted him last night to call it in, but someone else sent the text to Luca, someone who knew about the woman and wanted us to know she was supposed to die. Someone who didn't want her to die, Arya said. Or someone who wanted us tangled up in it. She thought about this. Is there a third option? There's always a third option. We haven't found it yet. She pulled the legal pad back. She looked at her columns. Then she looked up at him with the expression of someone who has just understood something they didn't want to understand. Sandra Chu called me an hour ago, my attorney. He waited. She found something in the trust documents. Arya's voice was very steady. The kind of steady you build deliberately, word by word, because the alternative is not steady at all. 18 months ago, 3 months before Nathan and I married, there was an amendment filed with the trust administrator. It wasn't in the copy I had. It was filed separately, with a secondary notation that I was informed and consented. Were you? No. The word was quiet and total. The amendment creates a provision for spousal claim under specific circumstances. If I'm found to have committed fraud, or if I'm found mentally incapacitated at the time of transfer, the trust interest can be redirected through a legal challenge process. She paused. The amendment carries my signature. Marco looked at her. It's forged, she said. Obviously. I never signed it. I never saw it. But it's been sitting in the trust administrator's files for 18 months, filed correctly, notarized, with a forged signature that Sandra says is close enough that it'll take a handwriting expert to prove otherwise. She picked up the pen and set it down again. The one uncontrolled gesture. He spent the entire marriage building the case. The affair accusation, the public scene, that's not the move. That's the setup. The move is what comes next. He files for a mental incompetency proceeding, or he files fraud allegations, and the amendment gives him standing to challenge the transfer. While you're isolated, discredited, and... Marco stopped. And preferably dead, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I was never supposed to fight this. I was supposed to be found in the snow in the morning. Tragic accident. Grief-stricken widower with standing to contest a trust amendment his dead wife apparently agreed to 18 months ago. The room was very, very quiet. Sandra can fight the amendment, Arya said. But it takes time. Months, maybe more. And while it's being fought, Nathan can file for an injunction on the transfer, which freezes the entire trust. She pressed her lips together. He doesn't even need to win. He just needs to delay long enough to... She stopped, breathed. He has debts, Marco. Big ones. He needs liquidity. He needs it faster than his legitimate business can generate it, and the trust would solve every problem he has. Marco sat with this for a moment. Then, How long has Sandra had the documents? She found the amendment this morning. She's been verifying it for hours. Has she told anyone else? Filed anything? Arya's expression shifted. A small, cold recalibration. Why? Because if Fenn built this and he has someone in our dispatch, he may have someone in other places too. And if Sandra Chu files anything before we know the full shape of the network, she'll tip them off, Arya said quietly, or she'll become a problem they need to address. Arya looked at the legal pad. At 18 months of her own life rendered in columns of evidence she'd been living inside without knowing it was evidence. She thought about Sandra, competent, loyal, careful Sandra, who had served her family for 11 years. I have to call her, Arya said. I have to tell her to stop, to not file anything yet. Yes. She picked up the phone. Then she put it down. If they're watching her communications, use the house line. Landline routed through our system. It's clean. She nodded. She picked up the bedside phone and dialed from memory and waited, and Marco watched her face while she waited, and what he saw in it was not fear exactly. It was something more considered than fear, something that had looked at the situation from every angle and arrived at a specific conclusion about what was required. She was deciding to become something different. He recognized it because he'd done it himself once, in a different room, in a different kind of crisis, and he knew what it looked like from the outside. Sandra picked up. Arya spoke quickly, quietly, clearly. She told her to stop, to secure the documents, to file nothing and contact no one until she heard from Arya again. Sandra pushed back. Professional instinct, the correct legal move was to act now. Delay created exposure. And Arya said, Sandra, listen to me. If you file today, I don't think you're safe. I mean that literally, please. A pause on the line. Then Sandra said very quietly, All right. Arya hung up. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the blanket. Then she looked at Marco. I want to meet with Luca. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I know what he's dealing with. He's dealing with the inside man, and he's dealing with Fenn, and he's dealing with the fact that someone in this situation sent him a message he still doesn't understand. She held his gaze. Tell him I have a proposal. Tell him I want to stop being protected and start being useful. Marco looked at her, at the legal pad, at the steadiness she was holding on to with both hands. He's not going to like it, Marco said. I know. She picked up the pen again. Tell him anyway. They met in the study at 9 that night, the three of them, Luca behind the desk, Marco against the wall, Arya in the chair across from Luca that was clearly not designed for comfort, the chair you put across from a desk when you wanted the person in it to say what they meant without getting too relaxed. She didn't mind. She wasn't relaxed. She told them about the amendment, about Sandra, about what she understood of Fenn's architecture and Nathan's financing, and the specific timeline she'd reconstructed from 18 months of marriage to a man she now understood she had never actually known. Luca listened. He was very good at listening, the kind of listening that cost you nothing on the surface and accumulated everything underneath. When she finished, he said, What's the proposal? The amendment is forged, she said, but proving forgery takes time and the right expert in a court proceeding that Nathan can delay and complicate. Fighting him through legitimate channels while he has money and lawyers and a forged document with my signature on it. She shook her head. He'll bleed it out. He'll delay until I'm broke or dead or both. So I don't fight the amendment directly. She looked at him steadily. I find the original fraud. Not the amendment. The fraud underneath it. The money he borrowed. Who he borrowed it from. What he promised them in return. Because if Nathan promised someone a piece of that trust, there's a paper trail, a real one. And a paper trail like that doesn't just expose Nathan. It exposes everyone he's connected to. She paused. Including Fenn. Luca was quiet. You have access to financial records I don't, she said. You have people who know how to find things that are meant to stay hidden. And I have 18 months of being inside that marriage. I know his patterns, his contacts, the names he mentioned and then never mentioned again, the phone he kept in his jacket instead of his desk. You want to run an investigation, Luca said. "I want to run it with you. Your resources, my knowledge. And what happens when we find it? We take it to the FBI." She said it directly, watching his face for the reaction. "Federal investigation, full exposure, not just Nathan and Fenn. The whole structure, whoever they borrowed from, whoever helped file the forged amendment, whoever sent someone to make sure I didn't survive last night." The room was quiet. She knew what she was asking. She knew what it cost a man like Luca Moretti to bring federal investigators anywhere near his operation, even tangentially, even for someone else's crime. She knew it was an enormous thing to put on the table, and she put it there anyway because she had no other move, and because she believed, on the basis of very little evidence and a very short acquaintance, that this man valued a certain kind of integrity even if the world he operated in didn't. Luca looked at Marco. Marco's face gave nothing. Luca looked back at Arya. "If we do this, it has to be controlled. Surgical. The investigation touches Crow and Fenn and the specific network around the trust fraud. Nothing else. That's all I need. If it goes wider than that, it won't. Not from my end." He studied her. "You were a real estate developer's wife 6 months ago. You were going to charity galas and filing foundation paperwork." "Yes." "And now you're sitting in my study proposing a coordinated federal sting operation. I'm proposing we gather the evidence for one," she said. "The FBI does the sting. We just make sure they have what they need." Luca looked at her for a long time. She met it. "There's one more thing," Marco said from the wall. They both looked at him. He'd been so quiet that Arya had almost forgotten he was there. Dario said Fenn contacted him last night, texted him the reroute. Marco looked at Luca. "I pulled Dario's phone. The text is there. But when I traced the number Fenn used..." He paused. "It's a burner. Clean. No trace. But I cross-referenced the cell tower it pinged off of." Another pause. "It was 2 blocks from this house." The room went very still. "Fenn was here," Luca said. Not a question. "Or someone working with Fenn was here. Last night. During the storm." Marco's voice was completely flat. "Someone who knew our address, someone who knew our convoy was going to come down Miller Creek Road, someone who may have been watching to see if the girl arrived." Arya felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with last night's storm. She pressed her hands flat on her stomach and held them there. "They know I'm here," she said. "Yes," Marco said. "They've known since last night." "Probably." She looked at Luca, at the face of a man who had just understood that his house, his controlled, secured, carefully managed house, had been watched by people who wanted a pregnant woman dead, and that the watching was still happening, and that the inside man they'd found might not be the only inside man. The proposal on the table was suddenly not an abstract strategy. It was the only option left. "How long do we have?" she said, "before they decide that whatever they're watching for isn't coming, and they move to resolve the problem directly?" Luca looked at her, at the steadiness she was holding with both hands, at the woman who had walked 2 miles in a blizzard barefoot and 8 months pregnant and had not stopped moving since. "Not long," he said. Arya nodded once. "Then we start tonight," she said. "We start right. They started that night." Luca cleared the East Wing study, a different room from his own, smaller, no windows facing the street, 2 exits. And Marco brought in a secure laptop and a portable router that ran through 3 different relay points before it touched anything resembling the open internet. Arya sat at the table in the clothes someone had found for her, dark cotton, practical, and she put her hands flat on the table surface and she started talking. She talked for 4 hours. Everything she remembered, every name Nathan had mentioned at dinner and then never mentioned again. Every phone call he'd taken in the other room, the ones where his voice dropped to a register she'd learned meant she wasn't supposed to hear. The trips to Miami in October and December that he'd described as investor meetings, and that had produced no documentation she'd ever been able to find. The man named Priest who'd come to the house twice and waited in the car, and whom Nathan had gone out to meet rather than bringing inside, which was the only time she'd ever seen Nathan go to someone instead of making them come to him. Marco typed. Luca listened. Occasionally one of them asked a question, and she answered it, and then she kept going. By 1 in the morning, they had 7 names, 4 shell company identifiers, 2 offshore routing patterns that Marco cross-referenced against financial databases he wasn't supposed to have access to, and clearly did, and the beginning of a structure that was larger and more deliberate than even Arya had imagined when she'd been inside it. "Priest," Luca said at one point. "Describe him." 60, maybe 65. Heavy. He walked like someone who'd had a knee replaced and was pretending he hadn't. Gray hair, kept very short. He always wore a suit that was too hot for the weather. Luca and Marco exchanged a look. "What?" she said. "Victor Price," Marco said. "He goes by Priest. It's a name he picked up 20 years ago and kept because he likes it." He looked at Luca. "He's been trying to move into the North Side for 3 years. You've blocked him twice." Luca was very still. "Nathan Crow is borrowing from Victor Price. If she's right about the meetings." "I'm right," Arya said. Luca looked at her. She held it. "Victor Price is not a real estate problem," Luca said. He said it to Marco, but he kept his eyes on her. "He's not a debt problem. He's not a trust amendment problem. He is a specific category of dangerous that requires a specific category of response." "I understand that," Arya said. "I don't think you do. Not fully." "Then explain it to me fully and let's keep moving." Marco made a sound that was almost a laugh and wasn't. Luca's expression shifted. The edge of something, not quite admiration, the precursor to it, and then he looked back at the map they'd been building on the screen. "Price doesn't loan money," Luca said. "He buys positions. If he gave Nathan Crow anything, he bought a piece of whatever Nathan was building, which means he has a stake in the trust." The room went quiet. "How big a stake?" Arya said. "Depends on what Nathan promised him." She thought about the trips to Miami, the car in the driveway, and Nathan going out to it. The way Nathan had smiled at her across the dinner table 6 months into their marriage with an expression she'd thought was affection and was now understanding was something closer to satisfaction. "All of it," she said. Nathan would have promised him all of it. Because Nathan needed someone big enough to manage the legal challenge, and Price would want a majority position or nothing. She looked at the screen. Nathan sold him the whole trust, for the resources to take it. The math landed in the room like a physical weight. 430 million, Marco said. Price puts up the infrastructure, the forged amendment, the legal network, the inside man in our dispatch, probably the contacts to arrange for her to not survive last night. And in return, he gets the primary claim once the trust transfer is challenged. And Nathan gets his debts cleared and whatever Price agreed to pay him, Arya said. Probably 20, 30 million, enough to rebuild. He sells me for $30 million, and he gets to keep his name clean because Price's people handle the actual mechanics. She said it without flinching. She'd had most of the night to get used to the shape of it. Luca looked at her. "You understand what this means for the FBI approach. It means it's bigger than a trust fraud case. It means it's a Price case, which means federal agents who touch it are going to need specific authorization, specific insulation, and they're going to want everything. Not just the trust, the whole operation." He paused. "Which is not something I can be adjacent to." "I know." "Arya, I know," she said again firmly. "I'm not asking you to be adjacent to it. I'm asking you to help me get the evidence. What I take to the FBI is Crow and Fenn and the trust fraud. The Price connection is what makes them move fast. But I present it as a thread they pull on themselves. You're not in it." Luca looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've thought about nothing else for 6 hours." He nodded slowly. He looked at the screen. He looked at Marco. Marco gave nothing, which meant he thought it was Luca's call and was staying out of it. "All right," Luca said. "We keep going." They kept going. Touch them. At 4 a.m, Marco's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked at Luca, and stepped out of the room. He was back in 90 seconds, and the expression he came back with was the one he used when the information was bad, and the timing was worse. "The charity gala," he said. "Harrington Tower, Saturday night." "What about it?" Luca said. "Nathan Crow is on the host committee. His name went up on the foundation's website 2 hours ago." Marco set his phone on the table so they could both see the screen. "Victor Price donated $200,000 to the foundation last month. He's on the guest list." Arya looked at the screen. At Nathan's name in clean serif font next to a photograph of him in a tuxedo, smiling the smile she'd watched him calibrate for public consumption across 18 months. "They're going to be in the same room Saturday night," she said. "In front of 400 people," Marco said, "including 3 city council members, a federal circuit judge, and the deputy director of the Illinois Financial Crimes Unit." The 3 of them were quiet for a moment. "He planned this," Arya said. "Nathan planned to be visible, publicly grieving, publicly charitable, surrounded by witnesses and officials." She looked up. "He thinks I'm dead. This is the victory lap." "It's also an opportunity," Luca said. She looked at him. She could see where he was going. She got there at the same time he did. "If we have the evidence by Saturday," she said, "we have 3 days." "Is that enough?" Marco answered. "It has to be, Mud." The next 72 hours were the most concentrated work of Arya's life. She slept in 4-hour intervals and ate when Marco put food in front of her, and spent the rest of the time in the East Wing study, building the case document by document, cross-referencing her memory against Marco's databases, against the financial records Sandra Chu was quietly, carefully pulling from the trust administrator's files through a back channel that kept her name off the request. The forged amendment was the centerpiece. Sandra had identified a notary stamp on the document that belonged to a firm in Evanston that had closed in 2021, a firm that existed in the document but couldn't have notarized anything on the date listed because it had ceased operations 8 months prior. The signature was forged. The notarization was fraudulent. The whole document was a fabrication filed by someone with access to the trust administrator's system and enough legal sophistication to make it look routine. Sandra found the access log. It had been scrubbed, but not completely. A partial IP trace that led to a legal services firm in the loop called Meridian Consulting. Meridian Consulting shared an address with one of the shell companies Marco had pulled from Arya's recollections. The shell company connected to a holding entity registered in Delaware. The Delaware entity had one listed officer, Douglas Fenn. By Thursday morning, they had a chain of evidence that ran from the forged amendment through Fenn's shell network to the Miami meetings with Price and back to Nathan Crow's personal accounts, where 3 transfers totaling $8 million had moved through an intermediary and then disappeared into a Cayman routing structure that Marco traced with the focused patience of a man who had learned this skill in a context he never discussed. "This is enough," Arya said Thursday afternoon, looking at the printed document stack. 47 pages. "This is more than enough." "For the trust fraud," Marco said. "Yes. For a federal case." "Potentially." He looked at her. "You need someone inside the Bureau who can move fast and quiet. Someone who already has an interest in Price." "I don't know anyone inside the Bureau." "I might," Luca said from the doorway. They both looked at him. He'd been in and out, managing whatever else he managed, the organization that existed parallel to this work. And he looked like a man who hadn't slept much more than she had. "There's an agent named Carver," Luca said. "She's been building a Price case for 4 years. She's clean. I've had reason to check. If you bring her this documentation with a credible witness and a direct connection to Price's funding of the trust fraud, she'll move." "Will she move by Saturday night?" "If I make the introduction, yes." Arya looked at him. At the specific cost of what he'd just offered, a man in his position making a direct introduction to a federal agent was not a small thing. It was not a reversible thing. "Luca, don't," he said, not unkindly. "I've been thinking about Victor Price for 3 years. If this gets him off the board, the cost is manageable." He looked at the stack of documents. "Make copies of everything. Originals go to Sandra, copies to Carver." He left. Marco looked at Arya. She looked at the documents. "He does that," Marco said. "Makes a decision and then leaves before you can argue with it." "Is that a personality trait or a strategy?" "Both," Marco said. He started making copies. Saturday came in cold and bright, the sky that particular shade of Chicago February blue that looked beautiful and meant the temperature was below 0 and the wind off the lake was not manageable in formal wear. Arya stood in front of the mirror in the East Wing bedroom in a dress that was not hers, deep green, fitted to a body that wasn't quite her current body, but was close enough because someone had thought ahead about this, and she was trying not to think too carefully about who and why. And she looked at herself for a long time. 8 months pregnant, 47 pages of evidence, a federal agent named Carver who had met with Luca the previous afternoon for 90 minutes and had emerged from that meeting with an expression Marco described as focused, and Arya understood to mean operational. The gala was at Harrington Tower, 42nd floor, 400 guests, Nathan Crowe on the host committee, Victor Price on the guest list. She pressed both hands against her stomach. "We're going to be okay," she said quietly. To the mirror. To her daughter. To herself, whoever she was now. Not the woman who'd dressed carefully for Nathan's parties, not the woman who'd stood at a gate in the snow, something that had grown out of both of those and was harder than either. Marco knocked on the open door. He was in a dark suit. He looked at her and then away, which was his version of the observation that she looked different than she had 6 days ago, standing in a frozen ditch. "Carver's team is in position," he said. 3 agents on the floor, 2 in the lobby. She'll wait for the presentation. "The presentation," Arya said. "Luca has the AV access." She turned from the mirror. "How?" "He knows someone on the venue staff." Marco said it without elaborating. She picked up the small clutch that held her phone, her ID, and a USB drive with 47 pages of evidence on it. "And if something goes wrong, I'll be 4 feet from you the entire night." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her directly. "Nothing goes wrong." "Marco." "Nothing goes wrong," he said again. The repetition wasn't empty. It was a commitment, and she heard it as one. She nodded. She walked past him into the corridor. Harrington Tower's 42nd floor looked the way Nathan's world always looked, lit expensively, populated by people in expensive clothing performing comfort they'd practiced so long it had almost become real. The string quartet was in the corner. The catering staff moved with the choreographed invisibility of people trained not to exist. Arya came in through the side entrance with Marco 2 steps behind and stood for a moment at the edge of the room, getting her bearings, finding the exits, finding the AV setup against the north wall, finding the federal agents she couldn't identify by sight but knew were there because Carver had told Luca and Luca had told Marco and Marco had told her. She found Nathan in 40 seconds. He was across the room near the bar, in a tuxedo, holding a glass of something amber, and talking to a city council member whose name she couldn't remember. He looked well. He looked rested. He looked like a man at a party he was confident about attending. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him for a moment, the way he laughed at something the council member said. Not a real laugh, the social reflex of it, the small performance. She had lived inside that performance for 18 months and mistaken it for a person. Her chest was doing something complicated. Not grief, not fear. Something older and less nameable. The specific pain of understanding a thing correctly when understanding it correctly comes too late to have changed anything. She looked away from Nathan. She found Victor Price near the window on the east side of the room, and he was exactly as she'd described him. Heavy, careful about his knee, suit too formal for the temperature. He was talking to Douglas Fenn, and she could see from their body language that it was a business conversation, not a social one. They were managing something. She touched Marco's arm. He followed her gaze. "Price and Fenn," she said quietly. "Together." "I see them." "Where's Luca?" "He's here." She scanned the room. She found him near the AV wall, talking to a man in a venue jacket, relaxed, unhurried, the practiced ease of someone who is never where he is by accident. He caught her eye from across the room. A single look, direct, steady. She nodded. He turned back to the conversation. 20 minutes, Marco said into her ear. That's when Carver wants the presentation to go. 20 minutes, she said. She moved into the room. She was halfway across the floor, threading between clusters of people with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating a space she understood to be dangerous, when she felt it. The specific quality of attention that means someone has seen you who didn't expect to see you. She turned her head. Nathan Crowe was looking at her from across the room. The glass in his hand had stopped moving. His face had gone through 3 expressions in approximately 1 second: shock, calculation, and then something she could only describe as the closing of a door. And now he was looking at her with the same expression he'd used in the foyer 6 days ago. The already decided look. The look that preceded action. He moved his hand to his jacket pocket. Marco said, very quietly and very fast, "He's reaching for a phone. Arya, don't stop walking." She didn't stop walking. She kept moving, changed her angle slightly, put a cluster of people between her and Nathan's sightline, and said back without moving her lips, "He's calling someone. I know, keep moving. We need 8 more minutes. We don't have 8 minutes. We need them anyway." She kept moving. She reached the edge of the room near the east windows, close enough to Price and Fenn that she could hear the low texture of their conversation without making out words, and she stood with her back to the wall and her hands on her stomach and watched Marco move parallel to her along the other side of the room, tracking Nathan. Fenn saw her first. He looked over Price's shoulder, and his eyes found her, and he went still in a way that was completely unlike Nathan's reaction. No shock, no calculation, just the instant, cold stillness of a man who has been in this exact type of situation before and knows exactly what it means. He said something to Price. Price turned. Arya looked at Victor Price. He looked at her. He had small eyes that were set very deep, and they were doing something now that was not anger and not surprise, but something more fundamental than either. Assessment, rapid and total, the eyes of a man calculating variables. Then he looked past her, scanning the room. He was looking for the exits. "Marco," she said, "I see it. He's gonna run." "I know. Luca." And then she heard it in his voice, a fraction of tension that she'd never heard from Marco before. "Luca, Price is moving." She didn't know who Marco was talking to. Earpiece, she realized. He had an earpiece she hadn't noticed. And then across the room the lights changed. Not off, not dramatic, just the subtle shift of the presentation screens coming to life on the north wall, the ambient lighting adjusting the way it did when a venue was about to move to a formal program, and the murmur of the room changed texture as people turned toward the screens. The screens were white for a moment, then they filled. Financial records, transfer documents. The forged amendment with the fraudulent notary stamp circled in red. Shell company registrations, $8 million moving through a Cayman routing structure. Nathan Crow's signature on a promissory agreement with a Delaware entity registered to Douglas Fenn. A photograph, time-stamped, geolocated, of Victor Price's car in the driveway of the Crow estate, taken by a traffic camera 3 weeks before Arya had been thrown into the snow. The room went very quiet. And then it wasn't quiet anymore. Nathan moved first. He crossed the room in 10 seconds, not toward the exit, toward her, and his face had abandoned all the social calibration and was just the face underneath it, which was ugly with something she couldn't name and didn't want to, and he was close enough that she could see his mouth forming words before she could hear them when Marco stepped between them with the specific physical presence of someone who is not going to move. "Back up," Marco said. Nathan looked at him. At Marco's face, which was completely neutral and completely immovable. "She's my wife," Nathan said. His voice was slightly too high. "Back up," Marco said again. Nathan looked past Marco at Arya. His eyes had the quality of something that has realized it's trapped and is deciding whether to fight or negotiate and hasn't landed on an answer yet. Arya. Her name in his mouth sounded wrong now. She didn't know why she'd expected otherwise. "Whatever you think you've, Mr. Crow." The voice came from behind him. He turned. The woman standing there was in her early 40s, dark hair, civilian clothes. Nothing about her looked official until you saw her hand moving toward her hip and the 2 men flanking her in similar civilian clothes with the same posture of people who have had authority for long enough that it lives in the body. "My name is Agent Carver," the woman said. "I need you to come with me." Nathan looked at her. He looked at the screen, still running, still scrolling through 47 pages of documentation. He looked at Arya over Marco's shoulder. "This isn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "You don't have anything. Whatever she told you." "Mr. Crow," Carver said with the patient finality of someone who has done this many times and is not interested in the opening arguments. "Come with me now, or this becomes significantly more complicated for you." Across the room, Arya could see 2 other agents moving toward Victor Price, who had made it 6 steps toward the exit and stopped when he understood the exits were not available to him. Fenn was already sitting down, which was either exhaustion or the specific calculation of a man deciding that cooperation was his best remaining option. Nathan looked at Arya one more time. She didn't look away. She stood with her hands on her stomach and her back straight, and she let him look, because she wanted him to see her, not the woman he'd thrown into the snow, not the woman he'd reduced to a loose end. The woman standing in a green dress in a room full of his ruined plans. His face did something complicated. She didn't try to read it. Then Carver touched his arm and he moved, and the agents closed around him, and the 400 guests of the Harrington Tower Charity Gala were very still and very silent as the most expensive evening of February moved from social performance to federal record. Marco turned to Arya. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. Then, "No." She pressed her hands harder against her stomach. "Marco." He looked at her face, which had changed. "I think," she said carefully, "that I need Dr. Fiore." His eyes dropped to her hands. "Now?" "She's been doing this for the last 20 minutes, Arya said. "I thought it was stress, but it's—" She stopped, breathed. "It's regular, Marco. It's very regular." Marco looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he had his phone out and was talking into it fast and low, and his other hand came up to her elbow. Steady, present, grounding. And he said, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we walk. Now. Don't stop for anything." She walked. Her daughter was coming, apparently indifferent to the timing, apparently finished with waiting, apparently ready to enter a world that had just, by 47 pages and one federal agent's authority, become slightly safer than it had been 6 days ago. Behind them, on the screens of the Harrington Tower Gala, the documentation was still scrolling, still broadcasting. The numbers and names and fraudulent notary stamps of a plan that had not accounted for the variable of a woman who refused to— She made it to the elevator. That was the thing she remembered afterward. Not the gala, not Nathan's face, not the screen still scrolling through 47 pages of someone else's greed. She remembered the elevator, the way Marco held the door and she walked in and the doors closed and the noise of the room cut off completely, and it was just the two of them in a mirrored box descending 42 floors while her body did what it had been building toward for 8 months. The contraction hit at the 29th floor. She put both hands on the elevator rail and breathed through it, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the book said, the way she'd practiced in a life that felt like it belonged to a different woman. And Marco stood beside her with his hand flat on her back and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. "How far apart?" he said when it passed. 7 minutes, maybe 6. "Fiore's at the manor. 12 minutes. Okay. Can you, I said okay," she said. Not sharp, just definitive. The lobby doors opened and the cold hit them, and Marco's car was already at the curb because someone had called ahead. Luca, she thought, or whoever Luca had stationed in the lobby. And she got in, and Marco drove, and she sat in the back seat with her hands on her stomach and watched the city move past the window. Chicago at night in February. The lake invisible beyond the lights but present. You could feel it, the weight of that much water that closed, the way it changed the air. She'd lived in this city for 3 years and never once felt it the way she felt it now. The specific substance of a place when you understand you almost didn't make it back to it. Another contraction at the on-ramp. She breathed through it. "Marco," she said when it passed. "Yeah." "The agent, Carver. She has everything she needs?" "She has the USB and the originals Sandra filed. She has Fenn, who started talking before they got him to the car." He glanced at her in the rear view. "Fenn talks when he's scared. He's very scared." "And Price?" "Lawyers. He won't talk tonight. But Carver says she doesn't need him to talk tonight." "Nathan." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Nathan tried to say it was all Fenn, that he didn't know about the amendment, didn't know about the reroute, didn't know about anything." He paused. "Carver has the promissory agreement with his signature, the one connecting him to Price's Delaware entity." "He signed it himself," Arya said. "He always signed things himself. He didn't trust anyone else to represent his interests." She watched the city. That's going to be the thing that finishes him. Usually is, Marco said. The thing that feels like control. She thought about that, about the specific irony of Nathan Crowe, a man who had spent 18 months engineering her destruction with meticulous, layered precision, being undone by a signature he'd put on a document because he didn't trust Douglas Fenn to sign it for him. The contraction came at 5 minutes this time. She stopped thinking about Nathan Crowe. Ellie came into the world at 2:47 in the morning in the East Wing medical suite of Moretti Manor, delivered by Dr. Fiore with the focused competence of a man who had seen many things and remained unrattled by most of them. The labor was 7 hours. There were complications with positioning that required Fiore to make 2 decisions in quick succession that he made without consulting Arya because there wasn't time. And she trusted him because she had no other option, and also because she'd learned something in the last week about the particular value of people who simply did what needed to be done without narrating it. At one point, during the hardest hour, Arya said through her teeth, "Talk to me about something." Fiore said, "What would you like to discuss?" "Anything." He talked about his first year of medical school, which had been in Rome, and the professor who had failed him on his first practical examination and whom he had spent the subsequent 40 years either despising or being grateful to depending on his mood. He talked in the even, deliberate cadence of a man who had understood that the voice was the thing, not the words, the voice. And Arya concentrated on it and breathed and did the work her body was demanding. Marco was in the corridor. She knew this without being told. She'd heard his footsteps once, pacing, and then not pacing, and then pacing again, and it had been useful. That sound, that small evidence of someone else's restlessness on her behalf. At 2:47, Ellie cried. It was the most ordinary and most extraordinary sound Arya had ever heard. Fiore placed the baby on her chest, and Arya felt the weight of her, small, absolute, indignant at the world for existing, and put both arms around her and held on with the specific grip of someone who has just understood what they were fighting for from the inside. "Eleanor," Arya said quietly, after her grandmother, after the woman who had built the trust that had almost gotten her killed, and had also, in the end, been the reason she'd survived. The documentation, the paper trail, the $430 million of her grandmother's careful, stubborn provision. It had drawn the wolves and also lit the path out. She held her daughter and breathed. Luca came in the morning. He knocked, which she hadn't expected, and waited until she said come in, which she also hadn't expected. He was in the kind of casual clothes that still looked like they'd been selected deliberately, dark, precise, and he had 2 cups of coffee and a particular quality of carefulness in his posture, the carefulness of a man walking into a room where the variables are different now. He set 1 coffee on the bedside table and sat in the chair, the one that had held Marco and then held him and had become over the course of a week the geographic center of every difficult conversation she'd had in this house. Ellie was asleep in the bassinet Fiore had produced from somewhere. She slept with the complete commitment of someone who had no concept of what it had cost to get her here. "She's healthy," Luca said. Not a question. He would have already asked Fiore. "She's healthy." Arya took the coffee. "Thank you." "For the coffee." "For everything before the coffee." He looked at the bassinet. There was something in his face that she didn't try to name. She was too tired and too raw, and naming things required a kind of precision she wasn't capable of at 6 in the morning, after 7 hours of labor and a federal arrest, and a week that had taken her life apart and rebuilt it into a shape she didn't recognize yet. "Carver called this morning," Luca said. "Fenn gave them the notary. The man who falsified the stamp. He's a disbarred attorney named Goss who's been doing document work for Fenn's network for 11 years. With Goss's cooperation, they can pull 18 separate fraud cases connected to the same shell structure." "Not just mine," Arya said. "No, not just yours." She thought about that, about the shape of what Fenn had been building for 11 years, and how many other people had been inside it, without knowing, living in the space between a forged stamp and a locked gate, with no Marco and no convoy and no particular reason to survive. "Nathan," she said, "federal custody. He'll be arraigned Monday. Carver says the promissory agreement with Price is the primary instrument. It ties him directly to the funding of the fraud and to Price's operation." Luca paused. It's going to be a long case. 18 months, maybe 2 years before it resolves. I know. But the trust injunction he filed was dismissed this morning. Harwick and Associates got the amendment formally invalidated at 7 a.m. Goss cooperated fully on the forgery. The trust is yours. Uncontested. She sat with that. The $430 million of her grandmother's careful construction sitting exactly where it had always been, exactly where it was always supposed to go. She felt nothing particular about the money. She'd never felt particular about the money. What she felt was the absence of the threat, not joy, just the cessation of a specific weight she'd been carrying since she'd stood at Nathan's gate in the dark and understood what he'd decided about her life. And Price, she said. Price has lawyers who are very good, Luca said. Carver has been building her case for 4 years. The connection your documentation provides is the link she needed between Price's funding network and a specific crime she can prosecute federally. He looked at his coffee. It'll take time, but it'll happen. You sound certain. I am certain. Carver is... He paused. She's the kind of person who finishes things. Arya looked at him. Is she going to come back to you about the introduction? Probably. And I'll manage it. He said it without drama, without false confidence, just the even accounting of someone who understood the cost of the decision they'd made and had made it anyway. The introduction was my choice. The consequences are mine. Luca, it's done, he said. Not unkindly. Final. She looked at the bassinet, at Ellie's small face, which in sleep had the quality of pure possibility, unmarked, unafraid, carrying none of the weight that was going to accumulate around her as the years went by. I want to set up a foundation, Arya said, properly, not the amateur charitable work I was doing with Nathan's name on it. Something real. The trust has enough capital to build an actual operational structure. She looked at Luca. For women in situations like mine, not just domestic abuse, though that, but specifically the legal and financial mechanisms, the ways money and documentation get used as weapons, how to find it, fight it, document it. Luca listened. I'm going to need legal staff, investigators, a security component. She held his gaze. I'd like to offer Marco the head of security position, if he's willing. Something moved in Luca's face. Not surprise. She didn't think she was capable of surprising him anymore, but something that might have been the acknowledgement of a loss, small and real, the kind you accept because accepting it is the correct thing to do. That's his decision, Luca said. I know. I'm asking if you'd release him from his current obligations. If he wants to go, I won't hold him. He paused. He won't want to go entirely. He's been with me for 9 years. I'm not asking for entirely, she said. I'm asking for the part of him that stopped a convoy on Miller Creek Road. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. You know exactly what you're doing. I'm learning, she said. I'm a fast learner. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd looked at her that first afternoon in this room, with the same quality of attention he applied to things he was trying to accurately understand. She met it the way she always met it now, without looking away. You're going to be fine, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, and she took it as one. Bob, Marco said yes. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without preamble, sitting across from her in the study that had become their operational center over the course of a week. She made the offer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. You're sure? She said. I just said yes. It's a significant change. Most good things are. She looked at him. He looked back. There was something between them that wasn't romantic, and wasn't quite friendship, and wasn't anything she had an existing word for. The specific bond that forms between people who have been in a dangerous place together, and have come out the other side still breathing, still upright, still capable of sitting in a room together without flinching. I'll need you to build it from scratch, she said. I don't know the security requirements for a nonprofit operation. I don't know what we need or how to get it. I know what you need, he said. I've been thinking about it. She looked at him. Since when? Since you told Luca you wanted to do this. He said it without self-consciousness. I thought you were serious, so I started thinking about it. She had no response to that. She wrote his name at the top of the organizational chart she'd been building on a fresh legal pad. The arraignment happened on Monday. Arya did not go. Sandra Chu went and called her from the courthouse steps afterward with the specific vocal tone of a lawyer who has watched a process begin that she is confident will reach the correct conclusion, which is not the same as a fast conclusion or a painless one, but correct. Nathan had entered not guilty pleas on all counts. There were 11 counts. Bennett entered guilty pleas on 4 counts as part of a cooperation agreement and was expected to testify. Goss, the disbarred attorney, had already provided a complete written statement. Victor Price remained in federal custody pending a bail hearing that his lawyers were already fighting in 3 different courts simultaneously. "It's going to be 2 years," Sandra said. "Maybe more." "I know," Arya said. "Are you prepared for that?" She was sitting in the East Wing room with Ellie asleep against her chest, the small weight of her daughter's breathing steady and rhythmic and present. Outside the window, the February light was doing what February light did. Pale, honest, no warmth in it, but light nonetheless. "Yes," she said. She was. Quit. She stayed at Moretti Manor for 3 more weeks. It was practical at first. Fiore's postpartum monitoring, the security question, the ongoing federal case that required her physical safety to be certain rather than assumed. And then it became something else, gradually, the way the shift happened in houses where people have been through something together. The manor stopped being a place she was staying and became a place she was leaving, and those were different things. Luca was there most evenings. They ate dinner sometimes, not formally, not the performance of formal, just food at the kitchen table or in the study, with Ellie in whatever arrangement was working that particular hour. They talked about the foundation, about the case, about the city and its specific mechanics, about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Books he'd read, a city in Portugal he'd been to once, the particular way Chicago behaved in the weeks before spring when the cold was still real, but the light had changed. She learned him. Not completely. She was not naive enough to think she had access to all of it. The 9 years with Marco, the decisions that had built the organization, and the decisions that sustained it, the shape of the man before the man she'd met in a crisis. But she learned the parts he offered, and she offered parts in return, and it accumulated the way things accumulate when there's no pressure on them to become something specific. One evening, about 2 weeks in, she said, "I know what you are." He looked up from the papers he was reading. Ellie was asleep in the next room, 4 feet away, the door open. "I know what the organization does. I know where the money comes from." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to explain it or defend it. I'm not in a position to judge it, honestly. I married a man who tried to have me killed, and I didn't see it for 18 months. My read on people has some documented failures." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite something else. "I'm telling you that I know," she said, "and I'm still here. And I want to be clear about the reason I'm still here, which is not gratitude and not fear and not dependency." "What is it?" he said. "I'm still here because you stopped a car on a dark road for a person you didn't know, and you had no reason to help." She looked at him steadily. "And then you helped anyway, and you kept helping even when it cost you things. And I don't know what to do with that except to say that it matters to me, that you matter to me." She paused. "And I wanted to say it out loud once, clearly, so you'd heard it." The room was quiet. "I heard it," he said. She nodded. She looked back at the legal pad in front of her. He went back to his papers. It was the most honest conversation she'd had in years. She moved out on a Tuesday. Sandra had found her an apartment on the north side. Secure building, doorman, 2 bedrooms, good light. The foundation's interim offices were 5 minutes away. Marco had already been through the building twice for security assessment and had opinions about the stairwell access that he communicated to the building manager with the specific precision of someone who was not making suggestions. Luca helped her carry exactly 1 box. It contained the legal pads from the East Wing study, every page of documentation she'd built over those 3 nights, and a small photograph of her grandmother that she'd had in her wallet on the night she'd been thrown out, and that had somehow survived the snow and the cold, and the week that followed, slightly water damaged at the corner, but intact. He set the box down inside the apartment door. He looked around the space, assessing it the way he assessed everything, systematically, from the exits inward. "It's good," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her. Ellie was in the carrier against Arya's chest, 3 weeks old, awake and examining the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone encountering ceilings for the first time. "Marco will check in tomorrow," he said. "I know. And if anything, I know," she said again. Not dismissive, just certain. He nodded. He looked at Ellie. He reached out and put one finger against her closed fist, and Ellie's hand opened and closed around it with the automatic grip of very young children, and Luca's face did something that she thought she would remember for a long time. Not softness exactly, but the very specific expression of a hard man encountering something that disarms him and choosing, this once, not to armor back up against it. He withdrew his hand. He looked at Arya. "Call me," he said. "I will," she said. He left. She stood in the center of her new apartment with her daughter on her chest and her grandmother's photograph in a box by the door, and everything she had managed to salvage from the wreck of the life she'd had before. And she breathed. Spring came to Chicago the way it always came. Late, and then all at once. The cold breaking overnight into something that still bit but no longer threatened. The lake changing color from gray to a complicated blue-green that meant the season had turned whether the temperature agreed or not. The foundation opened its doors in April. It was called the Eleanor Bennett Foundation, and it occupied a modest suite of offices on the north side staffed by 6 people that Arya had hired herself over the course of 2 months, interviewing them with the particular attention of someone who had learned the cost of not paying attention. Sandra Chu handled the legal division part-time. Marco ran security. There were 2 social workers, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial abuse cases, and an administrative coordinator named Deb, who had previously worked for a federal victims advocacy office, and who ran the intake process with a competence that made everything else possible. In the first month, they took on 14 cases. Women in the specific situation Arya understood from the inside. The money used as a weapon, the documentation turned against them, the legal architecture of a marriage weaponized by the person who was supposed to be on the inside of it. She sat in on intake meetings when she could. She didn't tell the women who she was, not usually. It wasn't necessary. What was necessary was the specific quality of listening that came from having been in the room yourself, and she had that now, permanently, in a way she couldn't have built any other way. The federal case against Nathan Crow and Douglas Fenn proceeded through spring and into summer. Fenn testified in June. Nathan's attorneys attempted 3 separate delay motions, each denied. Victor Price was indicted on 9 federal counts in July, the centerpiece being Carver's 4-year Price case, which now had the financial documentation it had lacked. The paper trail from Arya's evidence connecting Price's funding network to the trust fraud with the specific traceability that federal prosecution required. Arya testified in August. She sat in the federal courtroom in a gray suit with her hair pulled back, and she answered every question Sandra had prepared her for, and several she hadn't, and she did it in the same register she'd learned in the East Wing study over those 3 nights. Clear, precise, without drama, letting the facts carry the weight because the facts were heavy enough. Nathan looked at her once during her testimony. She looked back. There was nothing in his face she hadn't already seen. She had cataloged his faces over 18 months of marriage, and she was done adding to the catalog. She looked at him and she saw a man who had made a series of calculated decisions that had seemed, from inside his own logic, entirely rational, and she understood the logic and found it contemptible and was finished with it. She looked away. She answered the next question. The verdicts came down in November. Nathan Crow, guilty on 7 of 11 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing a false legal instrument, sentenced to 14 years. Douglas Fenn, guilty by plea on 4 counts, sentenced to 8 years, reduced for cooperation. Victor Price, guilty on 6 of 9 counts, sentenced to 22 years. His attorneys were already filing appeals that Carver said would take another 2 years to resolve and would resolve incorrectly for Price. Dario Sede had cooperated fully from the first day. He had provided the dispatch records, the communication logs from Fenn, and a complete accounting of everything he knew about the internal access Fenn had purchased. In exchange for full cooperation, he received a suspended sentence and mandatory community service. Elena completed her residential program in January and called Aria's foundation looking for resources for women in recovery, not knowing the connection, and Deb put her in touch with two organizations the foundation had partnered with. Aria thought about telling Dario. She decided not to. Some things resolved themselves without narration. On the first anniversary of the night she'd walked out of Nathan's gate, Luca picked her up at 7 in the morning and drove her back to Miller Creek Road. Ellie was with Sandra, who had become something between a legal advisor and a godmother over the course of a year and who had strong opinions about both roles. The morning was cold but clear, the sky doing its February thing, pale blue, honest, no false comfort in it. Luca parked on the shoulder of the road. They got out. The road was the same road, Mako, guardrail, dark trees, the Crow estate, visible through the bare branches as a set of roof lines she no longer thought about with any particular intensity. The estate had been seized as part of the asset recovery connected to Nathan's fraud conviction. It would be sold at federal auction in the spring. They stood on the road. The cold was real but manageable. Everything was cold and manageable now. He reached into his coat pocket and she thought he was reaching for his phone, and then he wasn't, and she understood what was happening approximately 2 seconds before he was on one knee, which was 2 seconds less than she would have liked to compose herself, but apparently sufficient because she didn't fall apart. She looked at him. At the face she'd been learning for a year, which still kept things and still had rooms she hadn't entered and probably never would, but which in this moment was doing the rare thing she'd seen it do before, declining to armor up, choosing, deliberately and with full awareness of the cost, to be visible. "I'm not a simple proposition," he said. He said it plain without trying to make it charming. It wasn't a speech, it was information. "You know what I am, what the organization is. That doesn't change." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. At the road. At the place where she had fallen and not gotten up, and the place where a convoy had stopped because one man had looked out the window. At the year that had grown out of that stop. The foundation, the cases, Ellie, the dinners at the kitchen table, the things she'd said out loud that she'd meant. She thought about what her grandmother would have said, Eleanor Bennett, who had built a trust that had survived every attempt to take it apart, who had documented everything because she understood that documentation was the only thing that outlasted people's intentions. She thought Eleanor would have had opinions about Luca Moretti that she would have expressed directly and without softening, and that after expressing them she would have watched very carefully and then probably said something tart and accurate about the specific value of people who showed up. "Yes," Aria said. He stood. He put the ring on her finger. It was not ostentatious. It was exactly the right weight. They stood on Miller Creek Road in the February morning, and she could feel her own heartbeat in her hands and the cold in her face and the specific texture of the ground under her feet, which were in boots this time. Good boots. Her own. She thought about the woman who had stood on this road a year ago. The barefoot girl in the silk nightgown with nothing and no one, collapsing into the snow with her hands on her stomach and her eyes closing and the cold moving into her like something that intended to stay. She thought about her daughter, about the 14 cases from April in the 41 the foundation was carrying now, and the forensic accountant who had found 3 fraudulent amendments in 5 months across different clients' estates, the specific shape of Fenn's architecture recurring because the men who designed these things recycled what worked. She thought about Marco, who was in an office 5 minutes from the foundation right now, reviewing a security protocol for their new office expansion. A man who had stopped a car on a dark road and had not, in the year since, once treated that decision as a debt she owed him. She thought about all of it, the whole weight of it, the cost and the return. She looked at the road. The girl who had fallen here was gone. That was simply true. You couldn't survive what she'd survived and remain the same specific arrangement of person. The cold had taken something and the year had built something else in its place. Harder, maybe in the way that healed things were sometimes harder than the original, The scar tissue that formed where the damage had been and held differently, but held. She didn't mourn the girl. The girl had been necessary. The girl had walked 2 miles and held on and made it possible for the woman to exist. That was enough. That was more than enough. Luca stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She turned to him. "That it's cold." He almost smiled. Didn't quite. "Take me home," she said. He did. The road behind them was empty and the cold was real, and the sky above Chicago was doing its honest winter thing, pale and clear and showing everything exactly as it was, without decoration, without apology, the same sky it had always been, over a city that kept moving regardless of what happened beneath it. Somewhere 5 minutes north of here, a woman named Ellie Bennett Moretti, 1 year and 3 months old, was being made to eat oatmeal by a woman who was technically her legal advisor and was ignoring that designation in favor of opinions about breakfast. And Ellie was objecting in the specific vocabulary of someone who had not yet developed language but had strong feelings anyway. Somewhere in a federal facility, Nathan Crow was beginning the long, unglamorous arithmetic of consequence. Somewhere in a North Side office, Marco Russo was reviewing a security protocol and thinking about a stairwell access problem. And occasionally, not often, he was not given to occasionally, allowing himself to think about the convoy stopping on Miller Creek Road and what it had set in motion, and finding that what it had set in motion did not trouble him. And on a road that had been a place of ending and was now simply a road, 2 people got into a car and drove north into the city that was theirs, imperfect and complex and fully, entirely real. The end.